an act of kindness that changed everything. At 42 years old, Margaret Allen had long since stopped dreaming of a better life. Working the early morning shifts at a bustling diner in the city's heart, she had grown accustomed to the monotony of her days. The constant demands of her job, her daughter's mounting college expenses, and her aging father's medical bills weighed heavily on her shoulders. Every wrinkle on her face seemed a silent testament to years of sacrifice and unfulfilled aspirations. But Margaret wasn't one to complain. She was a fighter, even if her battles were fought quietly, behind the counter of a place that barely acknowledged her presence. She wore her diner uniform like armor, and her tired but genuine smile became her way of coping. She believed in doing the right thing, even at a cost. One morning, as the diner buzzed with the usual clatter of plates and murmured conversations, an event that would unknowingly set her life on a completely unexpected path occurred. A frail older man entered, his face etched with both humility and hunger. When Margaret discovered he couldn't afford a meal, she didn't hesitate to pay out of her pocket. It was a simple act of compassion, one she thought no one noticed. But someone did. What followed was a whirlwind of events. A confrontation with the diner's new manager, a heartbreaking dismissal, and an unlikely twist of fate that would challenge everything Margaret believed about herself, her values, and her ability to lead. What started as a small gesture of kindness spiraled into a journey of resilience, redemption, and a life-altering opportunity to change not just her circumstances but the lives of countless others. Margaret's story shows how even minor actions can ripple outward, creating waves of change in ways we never expected. What would you do when faced with impossible choices? How far would you go to stand by your principles, even if it meant losing everything? You don't want to miss this story about strength, hope, and the courage to do what's right. Join us as we unfold the incredible journey of Margaret Allen, a middle-aged woman who proves that it's never too late to rewrite your story. If stories of resilience and kindness inspire you, subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for the next chapter of this heartwarming tale. Your support helps us bring more incredible stories like Margaret's to life. The morning rush was in full swing at the diner, with orders flying in and Margaret weaving through the crowd like clockwork. Despite her exhaustion, she managed a tired but sincere smile for every customer. Her mind, however, wasn't entirely in the room. She couldn't stop worrying about her 19-year-old daughter, Sophia, who was in her first year of college. Tuition bills were piling up faster than Margaret could count, and with her father's health declining, every paycheck felt like it slipped through her fingers before she could even breathe. "Order up for table 7, the cook shouted over the noise. Margaret quickly grabbed the tray and delivered it to a young family, her heart softening at the sight of a toddler giggling over a milkshake. She allowed herself to imagine simpler times when Sophia was that small and their lives felt manageable. As she returned to the counter, Margaret noticed an older man shuffling through the diner door. He looked out of place among the bustling crowd, with his threadbare jacket and trembling hands clutching a cane. His eyes darted to the menu board, his brow furrowed in confusion. Margaret's instinct kicked in, and she approached him with her usual warmth. "Good morning, sir. Can I help you with something?" she asked gently. The man hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like a cup of coffee and maybe a sandwich. Something small," he said, his voice shaky but polite. Margaret began ringing up the order, but when it came time to pay, the man's hands fumbled through his pockets, pulling out a small handful of coins. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his face red with embarrassment. "I thought I had enough. I'll leave." Margaret felt her chest tighten. It was a familiar pain that came from watching someone struggle with dignity. Without a second thought, she reached into her apron pocket, pulling out her wallet. "It's on me," she said softly, swiping her card. The man looked up, his watery eyes wide with surprise. "Oh, no, I couldn't," he began, but Margaret interrupted him with a reassuring smile. "Please, let me. We all need a little help sometimes," she said. "Enjoy your meal." The man's eyes glistened with gratitude as he whispered a heartfelt thank you. He took his tray and found a quiet corner, savoring each bite like a feast. Margaret returned to her duties, feeling a bittersweet warmth in her chest. She knew she'd miss those few dollars, but the thought of the man going hungry weighed heavier. Margaret didn't notice the sharp, calculating gaze of Greg, the new manager, who had been watching the interaction from his office window. Margaret's shift dragged on, and by the time the lunch rush ended, her feet ached, and her back felt like it had been carrying the weight of the world. As she began wiping down tables, Greg appeared at the kitchen door, motioning for her to follow him to the back office. Her stomach sank. She hadn't had many interactions with Greg since he took over management a few weeks ago, but his stern demeanor and sharp tone made her uneasy. She followed him, trying to steady her nerves. "Take a seat," Greg said, closing the door behind her. His voice was clipped, and his expression betrayed no warmth. "I need to discuss something with you." Margaret perched on the edge of the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I was informed that you paid for a customer's meal out of your pocket today," Greg began, his tone cold. "Is that true?" Margaret blinked, taken aback. "Yes, sir. It was an older man who didn't have enough money. I couldn't just let him leave hungry." Greg sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "While I understand your intentions, that's against company policy. We can't allow employees to pay for customers. It sets a precedent we can't afford." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "It was just this once," she said, trembling. "I promise it won't happen again." Greg's expression hardened. "Margaret, this isn't the first time you've bent the rules. You've been late several times recently because of your family issues. We need employees who can follow the rules to the letter." "But sir—" "I'm sorry," Greg interrupted, handing her a tiny envelope. "We have to let you go." The words hit Margaret like a punch to the chest. She stared at the envelope, her mind racing with panic. "Please, I need this job. My daughter, my father," she stammered. Greg stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Turn in your uniform before you leave." Tears blurred Margaret's vision as she gathered her belongings from the locker room. Her co-workers avoided her gaze, their faces a mix of pity and discomfort. She removed her apron with trembling hands, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. As she stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the weight of reality hit her. How would she pay the bills now? How would she keep Sophia in school or cover her father's medications? The questions swirled in her mind as she wandered to the bus stop, her legs heavy with despair. 2 weeks passed, and Margaret's world seemed to shrink. She spent her days poring over job listings, sending applications, and fighting the fear that she wouldn't find work in time to keep her family afloat. Every rejection felt like another brick added to the crushing weight on her shoulders. One afternoon, the phone rang as she sat at the small kitchen table surrounded by unopened bills and empty coffee cups. She answered hesitantly, her heart racing with hope and dread. "Hello, is this Margaret Allen?" a deep, polite voice asked. "Yes, this is she," Margaret replied cautiously. "I'm William Harris, and I'd like to meet with you regarding an important matter. Would you be available this afternoon?" Margaret's breath caught. The name sounded vaguely familiar. "May I ask what this is about?" she asked. "I'd prefer to discuss it in person," William said. "Would the corner cafe at 3 p.m. work for you?" Margaret glanced at the clock. It was 1:30 p.m. "Yes, I can be there," she said, curiosity outweighing her apprehension. At 3 p.m. sharp, Margaret entered the cozy cafe, scanning the room until her eyes landed on a sharply dressed older man seated near the window. He stood as she approached, extending a hand with a warm smile. "Ms. Allen, thank you for meeting me," he said. "I'm William Harris, the diner franchise owner where you worked." Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "The owner?" she stammered. I didn't realize." William gestured for her to sit. "Please, let me explain. 2 weeks ago, you helped an older man who couldn't pay for his meal. That man was my father." Margaret froze, her mind racing. "Your father?" William nodded. "He told me about your kindness, and when I learned that you were fired for it, I was furious. That's not how I want my business to be run." Margaret's heart began to pound as William leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'm here to offer you something better. I want to make you the general manager of that diner." The words hung in the air, surreal and almost unbelievable. Margaret stared at him, struggling to process what he had just said. "Me? A manager? I don't know if I'm qualified." William smiled. "You have compassion, integrity, and a strong work ethic. The rest can be learned. What do you say? Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as hope bloomed in her chest for the first time in weeks. I don't know what to say except yes. Thank you. As she shook William's hand, Margaret couldn't help but feel like her life was about to take a turn she never anticipated. For the first time in years, the future didn't seem so bleak. But what Margaret didn't know was that this new opportunity would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine, testing her resilience and leadership in ways she never thought possible. Margaret stood outside the diner, her heart pounding as she clutched the keys to her new office. The familiar neon sign above the door glowed in the morning light, but today, it felt different. This wasn't just a place of employment anymore. It was her responsibility. Her daughter Sophia's voice echoed in her mind from earlier that morning. Mom, you'll be amazing. They couldn't have picked a better person. The encouragement had given her strength, but as Margaret pushed open the door, the weight of her new role pressed on her shoulders. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of curiosity and tension. Her former co-workers, now her team, watched her with a blend of skepticism and quiet hope. Margaret offered a warm smile, trying to exude confidence she wasn't entirely sure she felt. Good morning, everyone, she greeted, her voice steady. I know this is a big change, and I'm here to work with all of you to make this place the best it can be, for us and our customers. As the team murmured their responses, Greg, the former manager, approached her with a forced smile. Margaret, welcome back. I'll be here to help with the transition. His tone was cordial, but his stiff posture betrayed discomfort. Thank you, Greg. I appreciate your support, Margaret replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that his cooperation wouldn't come without challenges. The day unfolded with Margaret diving into her new responsibilities. She reviewed schedules, inventory reports, and staff feedback. It quickly became clear that the diner had been running on outdated systems and rigid policies. Margaret's first task was implementing changes to improve efficiency and boost morale. During the lunch rush, she decided to step in and help on the floor. Grabbing an apron, she joined the staff in taking orders and delivering meals, much to her co-workers' surprise. What are you doing here, boss? Asked Sandra, a young waitress, her tone a mix of curiosity and amusement. We're a team, Sandra, Margaret smiled, and teams help each other out. As the day ended, Margaret gathered the staff for a quick meeting. Thank you all for your hard work today, she began. I know change can be unsettling, but my door is always open if you have ideas or concerns. We'll make this diner a place we're all proud of. While some, like Sandra, seemed encouraged, others, including Greg and Tom, a longtime cook, exchanged doubtful glances. Margaret knew earning their trust would take time, but she was ready to prove herself. Margaret arrived at the diner 2 weeks into her role to find chaos. The cash register systems were down, the kitchen appliances were malfunctioning, and a group of impatient customers crowded the counter. Lisa, the head waitress, approached Margaret with a panicked expression. Margaret, we can't process card payments, and the grill is barely working, Lisa exclaimed. Margaret took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. All right, she said firmly. Lisa explained the situation to the customers and offered them discount coupons for their next visit. Ethan, the dishwasher, please run to the supply closet and grab the portable card reader. Greg, call the technician immediately. As Margaret coordinated the team, she noticed Greg lingering near the office with a satisfied smirk. Her gut told her something was off, but there was no time to dwell on it. The systems were partially restored by midday, and the kitchen ran again. The health inspector arrived unannounced during the chaos and approached Margaret with a clipboard. I must say, he began, despite the technical issues, your team handled this remarkably well. Your hygiene protocols are excellent. Margaret smiled, relief washing over her. Thank you. We aim to maintain the highest standards. However, her sense of accomplishment could have been more lived. Later that evening, she overheard Greg on the phone in the break room. His low voice carried a conspiratorial tone. No, it didn't work. She handled it too well, he said. Margaret's chest tightened. Was Greg trying to sabotage her? She resolved to confront him, but for now, she needed to focus on the diner's immediate needs. The following week, Margaret received an unexpected visit from Detective Ethan Ramirez, a sharp-eyed investigator in a tailored suit. "Ms. Allen, I need to speak with you about financial irregularities involving this diner," he said, his tone professional but firm. Margaret's stomach dropped. "Irregularities? Detective, there must be some mistake." Ethan shook his head. "I'm afraid not. Our records show fund diversion and tax evasion over the past year. As the current manager, we'll need your cooperation." Margaret's thoughts raced. "Of course, I'll do whatever I can to help," she said. "But I only just took over. I've reviewed the records and nothing seemed out of place." "Sometimes these things are well hidden," Ethan replied. "I'll need access to all financial documents." That evening, determined to uncover the truth, Margaret locked herself in the office and combed through every receipt, invoice, and ledger. After hours of searching, she found something chilling. A second set of books hidden in a folder marked miscellaneous. The discrepancies were subtle but undeniable. Margaret sat back in her chair, her hands trembling. Who could have done this? Was Greg involved? Her mind flashed back to his cryptic phone call. She decided to confront him directly. The following day, she called Greg into the office. "Greg, I need to ask you something, and I want the truth," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Do you know anything about these irregularities?" Greg shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Don't lie to me, Greg," Margaret pressed. "I overheard your phone call the other night." Greg's face paled, and for a moment, he looked like he might confess. But before he could respond, Lisa burst into the office. "Margaret, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Margaret sighed. "We'll finish this later," she told Greg, giving him a pointed look before leaving the office. In the dining room, she was surprised to see William Harris, the franchise owner. His expression was grave. "Margaret, we need to talk," he said. Margaret sat across from William Harris in her small, cluttered office, her heart pounding in anticipation. His usually composed demeanor was replaced with visible unease, and she knew whatever he was about to say wouldn't be easy to hear. "Margaret," he began, his voice low, "I owe you an explanation. The financial irregularities Detective Ramirez mentioned didn't begin under your leadership. They go back years. Long before you were even hired." Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. "Years? How is that possible? I've reviewed the books and everything seemed fine." "That's because someone deliberately hid the discrepancies," William admitted, rubbing his temples. "The former financial manager and a few complicit employees manipulated the records to siphon money. When I discovered it, I hoped I could quietly fix the issue without raising suspicion. That's why I brought you in. I trusted you to turn the diner around without knowing the full extent of the problem." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest. "You used me," she said, her voice trembling. "You put me in a position where my integrity could be questioned without even warning me." William looked ashamed. "You're right, and I take full responsibility. I thought I could handle it alone, but it's clear now that the problem is too big. I need your help to make things right." Margaret leaned back in her chair, trying to process the revelation. Her instincts told her she couldn't walk away, not when the livelihoods of her team and the diner's reputation were at stake. But the betrayal stung. "I'll help," she finally said, her voice firm. "But we do this my way, with complete transparency. No more hiding, no more covering up." William nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Agreed. Whatever you need, you have my full support." The following day, Margaret gathered her team in the dining area before opening hours. The tension in the room was palpable as the employees exchanged nervous glances. Even Greg, who usually exuded arrogance, looked uncomfortable. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began, her voice steady despite the moment's wait. "I need to be honest with you. There's an ongoing investigation into financial irregularities at this diner. These issues date back several years, and while they didn't happen under my management, I've decided we need to confront them head-on." A murmur rippled through the room, some faces showing shock, others fear. Lisa, always the voice of reason, spoke up. "What does this mean for us? Are we in trouble?" Margaret met her gaze with determination. "I've already spoken to the authorities and will cooperate fully. I aim to protect those who weren't involved while rebuilding trust with our community. Greg shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. And what about those involved? He asked, his voice tight. Margaret's eyes locked onto his. They'll have to face the consequences of their actions. If you know anything, now is the time to come forward. The room fell silent. After a tense pause, Lisa stood. I trust you, Margaret, she said. We've already seen how much you care about this place. If anyone can fix this, it's you. One by one, other employees began to nod, offering their support. Greg, however, remained silent, his expression unreadable. Over the next few weeks, Margaret worked tirelessly to implement changes. She introduced new financial oversight systems, ensuring no transaction went unchecked. She also launched an anonymous suggestion box, encouraging employees to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. However, the real challenge came when Margaret decided to address the community directly. At a press conference held outside the diner, she stood before a crowd of skeptical reporters and concerned locals. We understand that trust has been broken, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. But we're committed to rebuilding it. Starting today, this diner will operate with total transparency. We invite you to hold us accountable as we work to make this right. The initial response was mixed. Some praised her honesty, while others called for boycotts. Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy, but she remained steadfast in her commitment. The changes Margaret implemented began to take effect slowly but surely. Sales, which had plummeted after the press conference, started to recover as loyal customers returned. Community members who had once been critical began to notice the improvements, from cleaner facilities to friendlier service. Margaret's team also started to transform. Lisa became a natural leader, often stepping in to support her coworkers. After weeks of tension, even Greg approached Margaret one evening after the diner had closed. Margaret, he began hesitantly, I need to tell you something. She put down the clipboard she'd been reviewing, giving him her full attention. Go on. Greg looked down at his hands, his usual bravado replaced with vulnerability. I knew about the irregularities. The old financial manager roped me into it. I was scared to say no and ashamed of my actions. Margaret felt a mix of disappointment and compassion. Thank you for telling me, she said after a long pause. You'll need to speak with Detective Ramirez, but if you're honest and cooperative, I'll do what I can to help. Greg nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. I'm sorry, Margaret, for everything. As Greg left, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. The diner's culture was changing, one person at a time. A month later, Margaret received an unexpected visit from a local journalist. Ms. Allen, the reporter said, your story has symbolized ethical leadership. We'd like to feature you in a piece about how businesses can rebuild after a crisis. Margaret hesitated. The idea of being in the spotlight made her uneasy, but she knew the story could inspire others to prioritize integrity over profit. The article Leading with Integrity, How One Diner Rebuilt Trust, went viral, drawing attention from business owners nationwide. Calls and emails poured in, asking Margaret for advice on implementing ethical practices. Meanwhile, William Harris approached Margaret with a surprising proposal. I want to launch a pilot program based on the changes you've made here, he said. If it succeeds, we'll expand it nationwide. Would you be willing to lead it? Margaret smiled, a sense of purpose swelling in her chest. I'd be honored, she replied. 2 months into the diner's transformation, Margaret began to feel the effects of her relentless schedule. Long days and sleepless nights had become her norm as she balanced implementing William Harris's pilot program with managing the diner's daily operations. Yet, she knew the stakes were too high to let up now. The team was slowly but surely coming together. Lisa had stepped into a leadership role, training new employees with an enthusiasm that inspired others. Following his confession, even Greg had shown genuine efforts to redeem himself, often staying late to help with tasks outside his responsibilities. But as things began to stabilize, a new challenge emerged. One rainy afternoon, Margaret received a letter addressed to the diner. At first, it seemed like a routine mail, but as she read the contents, her heart sank. A lawsuit had been filed against the diner by one of the former employees implicated in the financial fraud. The claim accused Margaret of defamation and wrongful termination, threatening her reputation and the diner's fragile recovery. That evening, she met with William Harris to discuss the legal threat. "This could undo everything we've worked for," Margaret trembled. "If the public sees this as retaliation, we'll lose the trust we've built." William leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "We'll fight this, Margaret. You've done nothing wrong, and the evidence is on your side." "But it's not just about winning," Margaret countered. "It's about how this will look to the community. We must show them that we're committed to fairness, even in the face of adversity." The lawsuit weighed heavily on Margaret, but it also strengthened her resolve. She spent weeks preparing for the court case, gathering evidence and statements from her team to prove the diner's commitment to transparency and justice. The courtroom was packed the day Margaret testified. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras poised to capture every moment. As she took the stand, she felt the weight of her team's hopes and the community's trust pressing down on her shoulders. The plaintiff's lawyer painted Margaret as an overzealous manager who had overstepped her authority in firing the former employee. But when it was Margaret's turn to speak, she remained calm and composed. "I decided to terminate employees involved in the financial fraud, not out of malice, but to protect the integrity of this diner and everyone who relies on it. Employees, customers, and the community," she said, her voice steady. "Transparency isn't just a policy for us. It's the foundation of everything we're trying to rebuild." Her testimony was backed by evidence of fraud and letters of support from employees and customers who had witnessed the positive changes under her leadership. When the verdict was finally announced, the judge ruled in favor of the diner, stating that Margaret's actions were justified and in line with the law. The room erupted in applause and hushed whispers as Margaret exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Integrity wins," and "Margaret for President." William Harris stood beside her, smiling for the first time in weeks. "You did it," he said, clapping her shoulder. "No," Margaret replied, looking at the crowd. "We did it." With the lawsuit behind her, Margaret returned to the diner and the pilot program. The lessons learned during the trial reinforced her belief that transparency and fairness were not just ideals but necessities. Margaret introduced new initiatives, such as employee financial literacy workshops and partnerships with local charities to support needy families. The diner became a hub for the community, hosting events like free meal nights for underprivileged children and senior citizens. One day, as Margaret reviewed the latest reports, Lisa entered the office with a wide grin. "Margaret, there's someone here to see you." Margaret left to find a man in a suit she didn't recognize. "Ms. Allen," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Michael Reed, the CEO of Harris Enterprises. I've been following your journey, and I must say, I'm impressed. The changes you've implemented here have become a model for ethical business practices across our franchise." Margaret shook his hand, a mix of pride and humility swelling in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. But it's been a team effort." "That's exactly why I'm here," Michael said. "We'd like you to oversee the national rollout of this program. Your work here has proven that ethical practices and community engagement aren't just good policies. They're good business." The offer was tempting, but Margaret hesitated. Her heart was with the diner and the people who had become family. "I'm honored," she said carefully, "but I feel my work here isn't finished." Michael nodded as if he'd anticipated her response. "Then how about this? You stay here and lead the program from the ground up. We'll use this diner as the pilot location and expand from there." Margaret's face lit up. "That sounds perfect." A year later, the diner was unrecognizable. What had once been a struggling business had become a beacon of hope and integrity. Employees were thriving, customers were loyal, and the community had rallied around Margaret's vision. During the diner's Transparency Anniversary celebration, Margaret stood before a packed dining room, her heart full as she looked out at the faces of her team, her family, and the community that had supported her. 2 years ago, I lost my job for doing what I thought was right," she began. "At the time, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to me. But that loss led to an opportunity to rebuild. Not just a business, but trust, integrity, and hope." The crowd erupted in applause, and as the celebration continued, Margaret reflected on how far they had come. Sophia, now a college junior, approached her with a beaming smile. "Mom, you've inspired so many people. I'm so proud of you." Margaret hugged her daughter tightly, her eyes glistening. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was all of us together." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the diner, Margaret felt fulfilled. She had faced her fears, stood by her principles, and built something that would outlast her, a legacy of integrity and compassion. And in her heart, she knew the journey wasn't over. Each new day brought more opportunities to do good, to inspire others, and to prove that doing the right thing was always worth it.